Good evening, everybody. Thank you for braving the forecasted weather. And it is my privilege to get to welcome you to the Dr. Thomas Hunt Morgan House on the campus of the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. I'm Dr. Jonathan Coleman. I'm the Executive Director, and welcome to the 2024 Hopemont Lecture. The Hopemont Lecture Series is named after our flagship property, the 1814 home that spurred the creation of the Bluegrass Trust, which next year will be 70 years ago. In 1955, the Bluegrass Trust was formed by innovative, forward-thinking Kentuckians who wanted to save Hopemont from demolition. And they started what was then only the 14th preservation group in the entire nation. So the Hopemont Lecture is designed to carry on their spirit of innovative, cutting-edge preservation work with the distinct goal of putting that work into practice right here in central Kentucky. With the Hopemont Lecture, we strive to bring the nation's foremost preservationists and historians to central Kentucky so that everyone with an interest in preserving our past can have access to some of the brightest thinkers in our field. And together, we can explore innovative ways to think about Kentucky's rich, diverse, exciting past, and encourage pioneering ideas and methods to circulate and to germinate right here. And it's clear that Kentuckians are eager to welcome preservation leaders. As you can see, we have an eager crowd tonight. Tomorrow, we will have an eager crowd next door at Hopemont for our second annual Hopemont Lecture Preservation Workshop, where Frankie, along with local preservationists, will gather to further develop tonight's ideas with Kentucky's preservation professionals, students, and grassroots leaders. And best of all, we were able to make this event free and as accessible as possible thanks to our donors, many of whom I see in the audience tonight. And so on behalf of the board of directors, the staff, thank you. We are so grateful. I know being in this room tonight with a lot of energy, I know you're glad you've made that investment in the Bluegrass Trust. You've made this possible, and we're really grateful for it. I think you deserve a round of applause. Everybody. And now, if you're not a supporter yet, we want you to invest with us too. You know, at the Bluegrass Trust, we're committed to historic preservation because we believe preservation is an investment. It's an investment that pays dividends for us all. It strengthens communities, it creates thriving economies, it builds connections to our past, to a sense of place, and it leads to a more sustainable future. And at the Bluegrass Trust, as we say every day, it's our tagline. Our goal is to make preservation possible for all central Kentuckians, and we work towards that mission every day. So if you appreciate the lectures we have, the detours, preservation matters, our advocacy, our educational efforts, then we would love you to join us as a donor. We can't do this good work with a whole lot of friends. And that good work includes the immense pleasure of introducing this year's Hopemont lecturer, Frankie Vagnone, or as he was called recently in the Garden and Gun, the Firebrand. Frankie is a public historian who leads the highly respected international cultural consulting group, the firm Twisted Preservation. Prior to his current practice, Frankie was CEO of Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early and Southern Decorative Arts. If you haven't had a chance to make it to Old Salem, you're missing out. It's a 100-acre national landmark district, a historic living site. And Frankie transformed that institution in ways that resulted in greater relevance, higher attendance, and a more sustainable future. He was also executive director of the Historic House Trust of the City of New York, where he managed 23 historic sites. I'm sure that was an easy job. And the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks. He has won numerous awards. He has given keynote presentations at virtually every important preservation and public history association in the world, from Melbourne to Bali to London and tonight, Lexington. In 2015, Frankie, along with his co-author, published The Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. which one journalist joyfully described as, and I quote, essentially a small bomb tossed into the staid, dusty, hands-off world of historic homes. I myself, in 2015, was in my first year of being a curator at a historic house museum, and I can't describe how important this book felt. Finally, someone had articulated what many preservationists, what many public historians, what we already knew, right? That these houses in and of themselves, are not the real reasons we preserve these spaces. The places are preserved to be in service to the people who use them, who study them, who live in them, who visit them, the people who encounter them. Good preservation practice is, at its heart, about people. Now, the fundamental shift that Frankie's work represented had some critics, and I have to quote some of these. An idiot. Nuts. And my favorite, a menace. But the past decade has proven many of Frankie's arguments to be almost prophetic. I have to agree with John Brown, president of the Chipstone Foundation. Frankie is one of the most important thinkers in historic preservation right now. And it's our honor to have him here tonight. Frankie.
Thank you all for being here. I kind of feel like the Grim Reaper, considering we have a hurricane barreling down on top of us. One of the things that I'm going to speak about tonight, a series of trends that we've been seeing in our consulting. And again, our consulting has been not just the United States, but really internationally. And it's fascinating to me that these trends are kind of happening in other countries. We can talk about that tomorrow, why we think this is the case. But everything that's happening politically and socially and environmentally is having a really seriously strong effect on the museum and cultural field. And I'm going to kind of go through those. As I present these, I hope you don't feel as though I am biased in any way other than these are things that are really popping up over and over again. And I'm using this as a kind of platform to start to think about how these things are affecting our situations. Now, it is true. When we first published the Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums, people didn't like me. And I will probably say that people still don't like me for lots of reasons. But I've always tried to be as open and honest as possible. Just a kind of queer, dyslexic, dumpster diving sculptor who happened to come into preservation through architecture. So I've had no preservation courses, but somehow 30 years later, I'm teaching preservation and museum studies at universities. Don't ask me how that happened. It just happened. I tried to tell our three daughters, everything you think you're going to be when you're 60, you're not going to be. You have no idea what the world is bringing you. And the world has brought me to this place that I'm presenting to you. Now, one of the reasons why I start off my talks, and particularly this one, is because I think that preservation, museum studies, and kind of cultural site management, even though it sounds kind of boring and cold, is really about the person. And each of us as individuals have these kind of complex histories about us. And I often say, what would your house museum look like? And, here's my life so far, married to a wonderful woman, 3 daughters. Now they're all grown up. My husband we're close to 16 years together, sitting in the front row. Our 33-year-old daughter moved in with us 2.5 years ago with our now 3.5-year-old grandson. So now we're all, including my ex-wife, my husband, my 3 daughters, our grandson, go on vacations. We just went to Provincetown for vacation for a week. This is the complexity of what it means to be human. So when I talk about house museums, I'm not talking about museums. I'm not talking about visitor experience. I'm talking about just absorbing and being present with the complexities that all of you bring to this evening. That's truly where I'm coming from. And my frustration with culturals and historic sites was that whenever I went to them, they said nothing to me. Now, I'm a queer man who loves pretty things, and so I can go and look at beautiful dishware and furniture and wallpaper and carpets, but there is more to these sites than that, and that's really where I kind of live in my professional best practice. So, again, just as all of you, fairly complex background. So trained as an architect, anthropologist, really a sculptor at heart. I've been sculpting since I was very young, painting, but I'm a very bad painter, so I really consider myself a sculptor. And I landed in running history sites through my architecture, because a lot of the architecture we were doing was to historic houses. And I ended up running a historic site because my background in architecture had such a sensitivity to historic preservation. And here I am 30 years later. Now, part of my professional practice is twisted preservation, which John spoke about, but it's also a website and a blog. And in this blog, I tend to write about things which are confusing to me. They're not things that are really central to preservation or museum studies best practices. They're really about kind of fringe topics, things that aren't spoken about a lot in the field. And if you go on the website, you'll see that the conversations are really marginal, but in actual fact, when you start to tether all of those together, you start to see a tapestry of a new kind of preservation and a new kind of way of thinking about cultural sites. Now, a big part of my professional practice has been with my co-author, Deb Ryan, who's a full professor at the University of Architecture in North Carolina, and a lot of research and teaching from around 2010 to 2015 when the book was published. And then after that, a lot of consulting with historic sites internationally. I'm just really showing you some of the tools that we really created to evaluate history sites, because no one really had paid much attention to them. No one was able to say, well, this is kind of boring, but why? And there was no way to compare a history site in California with a history site in Rhode Island. There was no kind of communication method, no language. And so what I really did, again, out of frustration was, well, let's start analyzing these sites from a kind of similar language. And I'm just showing you the kind of diagrammatic language. In a way, it's the kind of Rosetta Stone moving forward about how to think about historic sites. Now, one of the things I also started doing is what we call one-night stands. And I was a big proponent. I have multiple sclerosis, so a lot of times I have to sit down. And it would always freak me out in a historic house museum and in even a museum that I remember I counted 19 chairs in a room in a house museum, and there was no place for me to sit down. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to be here. I want to experience it. You won't let me sit on the floor. So what am I supposed to do? And these silly things just started to go through my mind. And I really started to push with this concept of, well, these were houses. People slept in them. They ate breakfast. They went to the bathroom. They did everything that we do. Well, if they did everything that we do, shouldn't I be able to experience that site in the same kind of relationship, behavioral relationship, as they did? And that's where this idea of a one-night stand came from. And I have to think, It's the Lincoln House in Janesville, Wisconsin, because before I had started this at all, they said yes to me sleeping in Abraham Lincoln's bed. Like, just, sure, come and sleep in Abraham Lincoln's bed. It was my first one-night stand. Freaked me out that I was sleeping in his bed, but it was at that point that I started to build a kind of collection in my mind about what these behaviors were. And it really started to inform my views that I'm kind of talking about tonight. So here, not only do I write about sleeping in those houses and using the furniture and having tea from priceless tea sets and putting my computer on top of a $26 million secretary in the John Brown House in Providence, Rhode Island. I did have a felt pad underneath it. But I also really think as deeply as my brain will let me. I usually will do it visually about things that those sites are not talking about. What are the narratives that they're not talking about? And so when you read the blogs, you're going to see that that's really what I'm searching for, is a new way of thinking about these sites. And again, a good part of our consulting has come out of that book, but it's also, we've been pulled into something I'm completely surprised about, which is to walk through historic sites that organizations haven't really even opened yet, and they don't know what to do with them. That there has been some acknowledgement that most organizations don't have the resources, both the people power and the money, to run them as history sites. Most history sites are not viable businesses. And so what they've been doing is calling us in to say, we know this is important, but what do we do with it? And I'm showing you one in South Australia. I forget the name of it, but they literally didn't know what to do with it. And they drove us a couple of hours out there to take a look at it. And that's the sort of thing. The lecture on the far, your right, was the National Council of Historic HDCs. It's the people who review within a historic district any changes to the buildings. So you would have thought I was the devil, and that they literally, as soon as I was done talking, somebody stood up and said that was very inappropriate. And it was, I didn't know what to say. He was the executive director of the place that was hosting it. Yes, that was me. They asked me. And to tell you the truth, my mind in thinking about cultural sites really happened when I was executive director of the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks. And one of our houses is Grumblethorpe, and it's in the middle of Germantown. And it's a really vibrant, wonderfully eclectic, kind of edgy part of Philadelphia. And I thought we were doing really well. And then somebody from the neighborhood threw a brick through the window. And I remember I had to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of having the window rebuilt. And I remember thinking to myself, isn't there a better use for that money in this neighborhood where there was food insecurity? They had no daycares. The list goes on and on and on. And I thought, here I am spending, I don't know what it was, I'm going to say $8,000 to $10,000 for one window. I'm like, is that the best way to handle a historic site? And that's where the book came from. And here's my daughter, the one interestingly living with us now. We were walking through a historic house museum, and she turned to me because this woman looked really funny. You all have seen those portraits. And the tour guide was telling us how important she was, and Claire looked at me like, ooh, like that. And the woman reprimanded my daughter and made her walk with the tour guide up front so she could keep an eye on my daughter. I got in the car and I started to write this notepad, which eventually became the book. The other part of my personality is that I'm a sculptor. And so here I have this kind of architecture, preservation, museum mind, public historian, and then I'm ultimately a sculptor. And so what I've been doing as I've gotten older is starting to try to combine these and to study ways that public history can kind of manifest itself in physical ways. This is one example. I ask this question all the time. What would your house museum look like? And I've moved around so much that it wouldn't make any sense that my house museum would be a bricks and mortar house. And my life has changed so much, it would be really difficult to give a single narrative to my house museum. So what I did is I experimented with this idea of a mobile life museum. So what I did is I collected all of my things, and I formed this museum that could close up, move around the world, open up, and become my life museum. And this idea of a kind of mobile museum, and then I went on to study kind of mobile and transient monuments when the Confederate monument issue was coming up. Just lots of things about how public history and fine art could somehow try to answer these questions between us. So now we do get to history sites. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from, which ain't really normal when you have a preservationist up here. These are the King Daddy houses, just a few of them. Mount Vernon, Van Cortlandt, which is a very prominent house in New York City. Of course, Monticello, and then we've got Colonial Williamsburg as the site. I am not so interested in when those houses were built. What I am interested in is when they were turned into house museums. Because now as I move forward, what I start to realize is that house museums and history sites have a lot more to say about when they were turned into public venues than when they were built. Now, they're not telling you that. What they're telling you, and I say they, I mean me, what we're telling you is that Monticello is really important because of Thomas Jefferson, blah, blah, blah. What they're not really telling you is that Monticello was targeted as being saved in part because it was Thomas Jefferson, but also because it was owned by a Jew. And they wanted Monticello to be in an American's hands. Now, it didn't matter that this Jewish citizen was in Congress at the time. What mattered was his religion. Mount Vernon, even though it was President Washington's estate, that is considered the first house museum. The reason why it was done that way is because they were trying to avoid the Civil War. And its placement was perfect for a kind of reconciliation between the North and South. You can go through these things all over the time. And I thought to myself, well, what else kind of pushed us into just becoming this kind of preservation museum world that we are? And now, I love some colonial dames. I have run some colonial dames house, Van Cortlandt House, and in Philadelphia. So, like, I've spoken at the national conference, and great. But interestingly, look at when all these organizations were founded. I thought to myself, wow, okay. Now, if we go back and look at those houses, and now we start to look at this, and then I know when other places were started, I went down this different path. And this is a really interesting, it's a kind of social scientist where they were tracking these cycles of violence and political unrest. And what I did is I started to overlay the formation of history sites, house museums, and historic organizations on top of this diagram. And then I started to see some overlap. And what you see is that a lot of our history sites were formed and historic organizations were formed during periods of very strong social and political unrest. That these things, from the very outset, were kind of formations and uses of propaganda for bias. So when we kind of raise our hands and go, history sites are neutral, they've never been neutral. And this chart shows you that they haven't been neutral. And then later on, I put the chart at the bottom, which is when most of the Confederate monuments were put up. And you start to see that there's a kind of relationship between all three of these. The formation of the house museums, these trends of violence, and the monuments. to the Confederate. So, what I'm finding is that house museums and history sites have from the very beginning been used as a means to propagate a kind of philosophy, a manifestation of an idea. And as things got more professional, those ideas became less and less manifest and more latent. Now, all you have to do is look at real examples and you can see it very clearly. We've got Colonial Williamsburg over here, where Rockefeller pretty much buys the town and tears down anything that is not colonial and builds everything to make it look colonial, really pushing in a period of intense immigration what it was to be American. What is this kind of exceptionalism that defined the United States? And the same thing is very true with Henry Ford and Greenfield Village. He didn't buy a town, he moved everything to his village. So both of these are very strongly kind of moves, manifestations of a philosophy, of a kind of convincing of what American exceptionalism is. And then you just have to look at the decorative arts as well. And we've grown up with it, so we don't really even think about it. I mean, I've got a picture of me in 1976 in my disco silk shirt for the bicentennial with the bell and everything on it, red, white, and blue. This is Wallace Nutting, who was a minister, but really what we know Wallace Nutting for is his reproduction furniture. And even more than his reproduction furniture are his photographs. He was also a photographer. Now, what he did was he bought colonial houses, restored them, and used them as retail centers to sell his reproduction furniture. And in that, he photographed these very serene, extremely curated photographs of colonial life and had them hand color tinted. I'm showing you one here. If you don't have one of these in all of your houses, I would be really surprised, because every tour guide room in every historic house museum I've been to has pictures of these things. And this defined what a house museum should look like. This was the aesthetic of colonial America. Now, it didn't matter that the streets were full of horse crap and the bottom of dresses were filthy and most living situations were on the second floor because the first floor were so dirty and so smelly. This is what people understood about colonial America. And just so you know that this is a kind of, in a way, a kind of aesthetic propaganda, look it up at the very top, and I know you can't read it, but this is during World War I, and basically he makes the point that these photographs are the best thing next to bringing home your boy. So basically bringing America to your boy. So you buy one of these and send the photograph to them. Fascinating kind of relationship about how messaging can be pushed forward through decorative arts. Now, there's this very small book. I'm a nerd, and I love it. It's The History of the Barricade. Now, doesn't that seem weird to you? The history of the barricade. It's just as minor as you all would think. It's a tiny little book, and it is literally the history of a barricade. And here's a map of Paris showing you with dots in this one protest period where all the barricades were placed. The reason why I have this in our conversation today is whether we like it or not, when you zoom in on those barricades, they're all about habitation. Everything in your house would be thrown in the street. Chairs, literally kitchen sinks, furniture, everything you had to stop the oncoming issue, whatever that is. And so my thesis here is that that is the museum field. We are this kind of accumulation of everything, and we're being asked to be everything for everyone, and we're being attacked for being everything for everyone. And I'm going to go through some of those trends that I have found.
The Compoculture Society shares a vision of a cultural shift from our current culture of death denial and body preservation to one of decompoculture, a radical acceptance of death and decomposition. Accepting death means accepting that we are physical beings who are intimately connected to the environment, as the research on environmental toxins confirms. As the saying goes, we came from dust and will return to dust. And once we understand that we're connected to the environment, we see that the survival of our species depends on the survival of the planet. I believe this is the beginning of true environmental responsibility. Thank you.
Essentially, one of the major trends that I'm seeing, and I've been seeing it really since 2010 onward, but it's still getting really strong, is that there is a change in death and decay in our perception of death and decay. No longer do we really think about death as like buying a concrete container and then putting the coffin inside and then having the embalmed body placed inside of that. I'm showing you here a video of how we treat collections in museums. We're essentially kind of packaging dead objects that aren't useful any longer. And there is a trend in generations now to really rethink what is death, what is decay, embracing it, changing the way that we imagine our death to be at the end of our lives. And that is having a direct effect on what people are thinking about in terms of preservation, restoration. It's not a strong leap, because if you think about how I view decay, and then you ask me to restore something back, like there's no way you're going to take my 60-year-old body and make it 19 again. As hard as you can try, it's not going to happen. And most people today are starting to realize that that's not a kind of viable way of dealing with death and decay. And it is having an effect on many different levels of preservation and museum studies. Now, also, there's a shift. We have grown up, most of us in this room, with a kind of honoring of the dominant, the heroic political figure. There's a very strong move now to value the common, residual, marginal, even unrestored. It couldn't be more opposite of what traditional preservation is like. So when a preservation organization is desperately raising money to restore a building or a site to its original condition, you have to start asking yourself, who are you doing that for? And what is that original condition? And when did that original condition start to decay? And at what time period are you trying to go back to? And so I'm showing you some examples. The National Trust moved away from the Mies van der Rohe label for the Farnsworth House. It's now the Edith Farnsworth House. And they've even changed the collections inside of the house to represent Edith Farnsworth rather than the architect, big, strong Mies van der Rohe. They're going to the female owner who paid him, pretty much designed the building next to him. In the middle is what's called the Ethics of Dust. It's a contemporary artist who also is the director of preservation at Columbia University. So it's no longer marginal. But what he does is he takes latex, puts it on top of artifacts, pulls off the latex, and the artifact of the dust and grime becomes the artifact next to the bricks and mortar artifact, questioning decay. What is of value? What we used to throw away is now considered part of the process of preservation. And then I'm showing you Francis Bacon's art studio, which was archaeologically deconstructed and moved into a museum setting just as it was. Didn't clean it up, didn't straighten it up. So this idea of bringing something back to its original state is really starting to kind of shift, and people are looking for the kind of details unrestored and residual. Now, this one is really hard for staunch preservationists to grab hold of, and that is there are a lot of people who are deeply frustrated with traditional preservation and deeply frustrated with best practices in preservation. The video I'm showing you is of the Portland building by Michael Graves, and many of you may know it's a landmarked building that was horrible to work inside. They considered demolishing it. As somebody who grew up in design during Michael Graves' era, it's one of the most important postmodern buildings ever built. So what they did is, rather than argue with preservationists, they forged a new way of dealing with this building. The traditional best practice is only restoring something back in its original condition with its original material in exactly the same details. It didn't matter if the details leaked. Didn't matter in this case if the window glass only allowed 7% of the sunlight to come into the building. Now they changed it and it's 70%. It's just one example of how preservation is being pushed at all levels to rethink what we all know as kind of best practice. The picture next to the Portland video is a Macintosh house, which essentially the details were so bad that it was leaking from the day it was completed. Knowing that there was no way they could, in kind of traditional way, restore that building, and if they restored it in the traditional way, it would still leak. They built a building on top of it. So now when you go to look at this building, this is you having your snack in the museum cafeteria overlooking that building. It's just fascinating. This is Menokin in Virginia. They built this Butler building on top to save the ruins, and they're working on placing a glass enclosure around that building rather than restore it. And this over here is it's the director's house in a Nazi concentration camp, I want to say Denmark. And so instead of restoring it, thank you, Netherlands, thank you. Instead of restoring it, they basically put it under glass. And so there's real questions about preservation and best practice, and also questions involving interpretation and how one values those things and where one spends the money. And at the bottom, you're also seeing this really strong move of preservation organizations starting to move towards privatization. Buildings that were restored and owned by nonprofits and opened as history sites are now getting sold into private hands with very strong easements, with some stipulations that they're open to the public a certain amount of time. And what they're finding generally is that this is actually giving better care for the historic sites than those kind of money-taxed nonprofits. I'm showing you here Old Salem's Tavern, which was owned by the organization I was working. We sold it, and now a restaurateur is coming in, doing the same thing that it was doing functionally before, which is now a restaurant, but they're restoring the whole building with historic easements, and it's open to the public. But this is another really strong movement. The fourth movement here is one that's very conceptual, but it's very clear. There's a rejection of categories, and that results in membership and any binary definitions of significance. Think to yourself, period of significance for preservationists, historic houses. What's happening is younger generations don't even want to define themselves with a sexual orientation. They don't want categories. They don't want to be part of a membership, and they don't want something to just be defined by one narrow thing. And so what's happening is that they're seeing these history sites that are, for instance, the Powell House in Philadelphia, 260 years old or something, and it only interprets 6 years of its total existence. What people are starting to realize is that does a disservice to what we as people have to do with those history sites, and it is definitely being reflected today. I've got the 1976 bicentennial icon, and I'm showing you the 2050th. They couldn't be more different. Centralized, contained, unified, one idea of America. And the opposite, It's outward focused. It's open-ended. It's multi-leveled. It's about America. What is America? They're very different things. And that is, in a way, a kind of manifestation of this shift of pushing off categories, pushing off membership. Now, after the last 5 or so years, we're all very aware of this, and that's an intense awareness of racism and bias in preservation and collecting practices. And organizations are really just now starting to understand that their very collections, the very buildings that have been saved, the very narratives that are written about, the books that are in libraries, the way those books have been categorized in the library catalog, all of that has levels of bias to it. And I'm just showing you some of the real intense review. Are historic districts discriminatory on all levels, economically, racially, age? Not only that, but also the history sites. Which history sites have we saved? Why have they been saved? Are they representative of real life? And then I'm showing you at the bottom, this is the Powell House in Philadelphia, another one of the sites that I ran. I'm showing you a red-lined map of Philadelphia, and the Powell House in part was saved because they wanted it to be a kind of wall to the Jewish Italian populations that were south of it, and they wanted it to stop the movement north in Philadelphia. And you can clearly see it when you look at the redlining map. And here's a picture of the purchase date of the Powell House waving the American flag. You can see that this was a protest in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. A lot of people were not only protesting the statue out front, but also the fact that indigenous cultures were in a natural history museum, not in the art museum, basically with the animals. And again, these are things that just weren't thought about 25 years, or they certainly were thought about, but not at a kind of dominant culture level. And then you're seeing that history sites are at the forefront of these culture wars. I'm showing you a plantation house in North Carolina, which was set on fire during a protest. I'm showing you the Daughters of the Confederacy in Richmond that was ransacked. I'm showing you labor protests at the Guggenheim in New York City. The National Trust of the UK did an entire year-long study of slavery and the enslaved, and then also did an entire year exhibition and study of LGBTQ issues in their sites. They were attacked politically for it, and potentially money was pulled. And then I think we're all very aware of the Sackler issue with being board members on nonprofit boards and being members of boards of art museums and history sites. And they've given so much money that their names were put on buildings, and those names are now starting to be taken down. And then I'm showing you here on the bottom, this was a board member at the Whitney that stepped down because he produced tear gas, which was used in a war. So you can see that these culture wars are having a direct effect now on museums. Museums are not being thought of as just places that house objects or tell a story, that they are much more deeply ingrained with our society. This is also a very big shift, and that is that historic sites are seen as place of communal trauma. And that is, for instance, the beautiful plantations in the South, which were used for weddings. Very strongly, probably 5 or 6 years ago, people were saying, look, these are concentration camps, and in my mind, I'm not going to a wedding here. The National Trust, as I just mentioned, used one of their estates to put on an exhibit and write about and study the last group of men that were hung in the UK because they were queer. And they got enormous pushback about that. And then I'm showing you a gay club in New Orleans, which was firebombed. And that building really has very little kind of notation of it. It just now is a commercial building. And on the bottom, I'm showing you, this is a KKK rally where they attacked a gay club. in 1937, our gay group. And what I'm showing you on the far right is what's called the lynching tree. It's a tree in Brooksville, Florida, in the middle of the town, in front of the courthouse. It's a beautiful park, and this tree is where they lynched people. And so you can see that these sites, these places of public venue, are now starting to be seen as places of communal trauma. And we also all are aware of the climate issues that are happening, and they have broken the walls of the museum and the historic house museums. I'm just showing you a few of many examples of protesters coming into museums, throwing soup and paint on paintings. I'm showing you a die-in at the Natural History Museum in London, because they took money from British Petroleum as part of their funding. The same thing at the Louvre. I'm showing you they were pushed to divest from petroleum investments in their endowment. And then I'm also showing you that there's this intense push with environmentalism at the marginal levels of society, and it is having a great deal of pressure on museums and cultural organizations. Now, the final two that I want to talk about are really kind of insider discussions, and it may be that there are more discussions for tomorrow, but there's certainly something we're seeing in our consulting. One is there's this bifurcated perspective of trust. On one hand, we've always heard that museums are probably one of the most trusted places, even above government and scientists. It's been that way for a while. But interestingly, when you start to look at the other side of this, it's not playing out. But because we have this intense pushback on museums for labor issues and all the stuff that I just went through. So how is it that public perception of museums is so high, but internally, staffs are pushing back so negatively on the organizations? I have to say to keep your eye on this, because what I think is happening is that what these people are protesting are really the people that are on the boards. Because if you look at the bottom of this chart, it's corporations and business people. And those are the people who are running the nonprofits. And I don't think it's the nonprofit interpretations that are being attacked in business practices. I think it's the boards that are being attacked. And that leads me to my final one, and that is that as an element of the income inequality, which has just increased exponentially, these are the very people who are running our nonprofits. And as the power and money increases with this group, and they take on more and more board membership and leadership, they're in turn trying to push more and more influence on interpretation, staffing, pay, all of those things. So what's happening is there's this kind of erosion, which has always been really clear between the board's role and the staff's role. And now what you're seeing is that boards, because they're bringing so much money to the organizations and there's so much power and control, that they're pushing through this invisible wall and trying to run the nonprofit organizations in themselves. And the nonprofit structure was built this way so that you would have checks and balances. And what's happening is the checks and balances are being eroded. So what does all of this tell us? And that's what we can talk about tomorrow. I apologize for bringing these not so great trends to you all, but I think that they really are a strong reflection on the world that we're in right now. And for me to be really rosy and just say, oh, it's all about interpretation or, bricks and mortar and the best practice of how to repoint a building, to tell you the truth, collections maintenance, preservation, restoration, those things are way, way on the bottom of the list of what the public is perceiving as important in our organizations. The question is, are we going to listen, and how are we going to respond to that? Thank you again, all of you, for asking me to come here. Thank you.